believe series through the Baptist Faith and Message in Article 10 on last things. And so we took a few weeks to walk through the article and break it down in what we believe as Southern Baptists about last things. And really we said that the article, it really just kind of highlights the things that we know for sure, right? And we're going to read that in just a moment on last things. And started last week, we kind of took a detour off of last things into what we call Millennium views, okay? Our views surrounding that 1,000-year reign of Jesus that we read about in Revelation. And that's kind of where we're going to pick up tonight. But I want us to pick up each week reminding ourselves what the article actually says so that we're not detouring too far out of it, okay? So here it is. Here's the article. God, in his own time and in his own way, will bring the world to its appropriate end. According to his promise, Jesus Christ will return personally and visibly in glory to the earth. The dead will be raised, and Christ will judge all men in righteousness. The unrighteous will be consigned to hell, the place of everlasting punishment. The righteous and the resurrected and glorified bodies will receive their reward and will dwell forever in heaven with the Lord. Okay? So that's our article. That's what it says. And one thing that I don't want us to miss, so if you have your handout, okay, you look on that first page, under the heading, the Millennial Views Comparison Handout, there's something that says shared conviction. You see that? All four views affirm the bodily return of Jesus Christ, the final judgment, the defeat of evil, and the everlasting kingdom of God. And I point that out because all four of these views that we're walking through on the millennium can wholeheartedly agree with what that article says. Okay? All four of those views. Okay? All the truths listed about what we believe about the last things, anyone who holds to any of these views gladly affirm those things, okay? And we kind of said that our article on the last things is it's vague, okay? And it's vague on purpose, okay? So that any holding to these views can affirm what that says, okay? And so we said really the article itself is kind of a minimum of what we believe about last things, okay? And the main things we know for sure that we kind of walked through and pointed out when we went through the article are these truths, okay? Here they are. That we are in the last days now, okay? Remember talking about that. We are in the end times, the last days, okay? 2, this world will end, okay? We affirm that. Christ will return personally, visibly, and gloriously. We affirm that. There will be a bodily resurrection of both believers and unbelievers. We know that. There is a judgment of all individuals. And every individual will enter into an eternal destiny of either hell or heaven. Okay? We know that for sure. And that's kind of the truth that our statement of faith on last things says. But what we pointed out is that missing from that statement is anything about what we believe about the tribulation, okay, or the millennium, or the number of comings of Christ, okay? These views have different ideas about the number of times Jesus returns, okay? These views have different opinions and beliefs about how many resurrections there are, okay? Or how many judgments there are, okay? And the reason why our statement of faith doesn't say this is what we believe about the tribulation or the millennium or this many resurrections is because these are areas Bible-believing, Jesus-loving Christians have different views on. And that's pretty well represented in these views that we were walking through, okay? And how we started last week is how I want to kind of get us back into it this week, and that is a lot of these different views have to do with how we interpret one passage, okay, primarily, and that is Revelation 20, 1 through 6. And so I want us to read it, and then we'll kind of do a summary of the view we looked at last week, and we'll get into the view that we're going to look at this week. So here's what Revelation 20 says in verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for how long? 1,000 years. How long is a millennium? 1,000 years. Okay, so that's where this comes from, our view of 1,000 years. That's what the millennium views are. And threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Okay? So, that handout shows the four views of these 1,000 years, this millennium we just read about in Revelation 20. Okay? And the first view we looked at last week, how many of y'all remember? What view is it? Yep. Amillennialism. Okay? That's what we outlined. And we outlined what amillennialism teaches. Okay? And I'll try to give just a brief summary of this before we move on. But if you want to know what we said in detail, you can go to our YouTube page. How many of you know the church has a YouTube page? Okay. If you type in Fellowship Baptist Church, Ripley, Mississippi, it'll pull up. Click on it. Click on the tab that says Live, and you can see all of the live services of the past Wednesdays and Sundays. Okay? So go to the page, click on the Wednesday night from last week, and you can see in detail what we said. Okay? I want to give a brief summary of it, though. Okay? What amillennialism teaches. Okay? And still try to do it justice. Okay? So in amillennialism, when is the millennium? It's going to be half summary, half quiz. When is this millennial reign of Christ described in Revelation 20 according to amillennialism? It's now. Okay? It's now. From the time of Christ's resurrection and ascension, the church age, that is the age we're in now, okay, and the millennial reign of Christ run simultaneously. Okay? They're at the same time, the church age and this millennium. And so what that means, an amillennial interprets the 1,000 years not to be literal 1,000 years, but symbolic. Okay? Symbolic. And that is symbolic for a long period of time. And there is some truth, right? Like when you read Revelation, a lot of those images and numbers that we read in the book, those are symbols. They are pictures in a lot of ways, okay? So there is some precedent to say, hey, maybe this is a symbolic number, okay? So that's how they interpret it. 1,000 years is not literal, but symbolic and represents just a long period of time, okay? And if you remember, one of the things amillennialism teaches is just one physical resurrection. Okay? One physical resurrection. And so, one of the problems in Revelation 20 is that it describes clearly two resurrections, doesn't it? It literally says there is a first resurrection, and then after this, the rest of the dead come to life. Okay? So how many resurrections does that make? 2. Okay? And so, what amillennial says is that the first resurrection is a spiritual resurrection. And so I taught you last week, okay, this idea of the intermediate state. How many of you remember what the intermediate state is? Yeah. Intermediate means in between, okay? So, when a believer who trusts in Jesus, who's saved, dies, okay, their soul is separated from their physical body. Where does that soul go? To be with Jesus in the presence of the Lord, okay? An amillennial says that's the first resurrection, okay? That intermediate state. And we call it the intermediate state because do believers who die here in this world stay souls forever, separated from their bodies? No. We believe that when Jesus returns, okay, that our physical bodies are raised, glorified, and changed, and our souls are reunited to our bodies. That's why we call it the intermediate state. So an amillennial teaches that that is the first resurrection, okay, that when our physical bodies die, our souls go to be in heaven with the Lord. That's the first resurrection, okay? Meaning there is only one physical resurrection. When Jesus returns to the earth, his second coming, then there is one physical resurrection of believers and unbelievers at the same time, and believers' bodies are changed and glorified at that time, okay? During this millennium, amillennialism teaches, and we read it in Revelation 20, that Satan is bound, right? Remember seeing that? Satan is bound. And what that means, they say, it doesn't mean that he is contained completely, but that his power is restricted. And we read in Revelation 20 that the reason for his binding is why? Satan is bound so that, what? He can no longer deceive the nations. Okay? So an amillennial teaches that because of the work of Jesus, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, and now our being filled with the Holy Spirit to preach the gospel, that has restricted Satan's powers to deceive the nations. Okay? That we can preach the gospel boldly with the hope that the power of the gospel will lead people to believe. Okay? So he's still active in the world, but his power is restricted. That's how they interpret this binding. Okay? And so, they say that the saints who are in heaven with Jesus now, who have died on earth, that is the saints who are reigning with Jesus. Okay? Because the millennium is now, the reign of Christ with the saints is when? Now. Right? It is those souls who have gone on to be with the Lord that John sees reigning with Jesus. Okay? So saints are reigning in heaven with Jesus now, and the church on earth experiences tribulation. Okay? So an amillennial believes that the whole experience of the church from the resurrection of Jesus until he returns is a time of tribulation. That is the tribulation. Okay? It's the whole experience of the church until Jesus returns. And then, at the end of the millennium, Jesus will return in glory to the earth. The dead in Christ will be raised in glorified bodies. That's the second resurrection. But the only physical resurrection, according to amillennial. And then, just like Paul teaches, believers who are on the earth when Jesus comes, they are changed in the twinkling of an eye and become glorified. Okay? And then if we just keep going down the timeline, okay, Jesus returns, resurrection, glorified. Then the enemies of Christ are defeated at the final rebellion, okay. The unbelieving dead are resurrected. There's a final judgment, and then every person, every individual, enters into their eternal destiny. Then there is the new heavens and the new earth and what's called the eternal state. Okay? That's an amillennial view. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a very broad summary of what we looked at last week. Again, detailed, go watch last week's Wednesday night teaching. Okay? And then what we did after we highlighted what amillennialism teaches, we looked at the strengths of the view, okay? And then we looked at the challenges of the view. And I think I gave some pretty good challenges. And really what I said, because of these challenges is why I'm not an amillennial. Okay? And I even told, I want to be, right? Like, it is the simplest view. If that sounded complicated to you, just wait. It really is. It is, without a doubt, the simplest view, okay? The most complicated view, without a doubt, is dispensational premillennialism. And we'll look at that probably maybe next week or the next week, okay? And my guess is this is probably the view many of you have been taught and believe. And it is the most complicated, okay? But we'll talk about that in due time, okay? So what I want to do tonight is I want to look at what's called post-millennialism. Post-millennialism. And then we'll save those two premillennial views so that we have time to look at those together. I don't want to separate those. I want to look at them together if we can, okay? So what do you believe, or what do you think post-millennialism believes about the millennium? Yes, all right, that there is a second coming of Jesus, and so what a post-millennial believes is about when does that happen? All right, there it is. Post-millennial. Christ returns after the millennium, okay? So the millennium comes first, and then Jesus returns, okay? Now, this is different from, say, amillennial, because the millennium is not something that's going to come. It's here. It's now, okay? It's also different from premillennialism, because just like pre and post, pre means the millennium before, then Christ comes, okay? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So postmillennium teaches Christ will return after the millennium. Did I say that wrong about premillennialism? Okay. I thought I may have meant postmillennialism. Okay. All right. So, yes, Jesus comes before, and then there's the millennium in premillennialism. Okay? In postmillennialism, it's the millennium, then Jesus comes. He comes after the millennium. Okay. Trying to keep those together. So a postmillennial believes that the millennium comes gradually, okay? And that it will be ushered in by believers on earth as the gospel spreads to all nations. Then after that, Jesus comes back, okay? The gospel will gradually progress across the world, and then the world is transformed by the gospel, and it brings a period of biblical truth and righteousness in the world. And that is the millennium, okay, in this view. So the main idea is the world is slowly transformed by the spread of the gospel. So you see it on your handout. Postmillennialism at the very bottom of that box. Key idea: the gospel progressively transforms the world before Christ returns. Yeah, really, in a sense. It's the idea that as the gospel spread across the world and more people come to Jesus, then the world is transformed. Okay? And then, so a postmillennial will have the same understanding of Satan's binding as an amillennial. Yeah. That he is bound in the sense that he's restricted. Yeah. Still active, but restricted so that the gospel can spread and then the world is changed by the spread of the gospel. So they believe that as the church grows and as Christians have greater influence in society, that the world will function in the way God designed, and that will bring righteousness and biblical truth spreading across the globe. Does that make sense? Okay. And because of the gospel spread, gradually, there will be a flourishing of goodness and righteousness on the earth to the extent that evil becomes more and more restricted and restrained. Okay? And all this happens before Jesus comes. Okay? In postmillennial thought, this is called the golden age of gospel success. Okay? And the idea is that over years and years and years and years of time, the world progressively gets better and better and more righteous. And after it reaches a point, that's the millennium. And then Jesus comes. A millennial age of peace and righteousness will come about on the earth. Okay? And you can see it, that the second sheet on your handout, I want to point this out to you. So you notice each view has a bar, okay, on your handout. On the one that says Christian History Timelines, the end, okay? And if you notice, historic premillennialism, dispensational premillennial, and amillennial all have the bar going from lighter to darker. You see that? And that means that the world becomes more evil. All right? But if you notice, what does postmillennialism do? He goes from darker to what? Lighter. Okay? Because the thought is, as the world is more and more won to Christ, the nations are discipled in Christ, then what happens? The world gets better. Society is transformed. There's more righteousness. Evil and sin is more restricted. So, in their view, during the church age, the world gets better and better and better. Okay? Moral progression is towards righteousness and not unrighteousness. Okay? And then, according to postmillennialism, after this golden age of the millennium, because of the progression of the gospel, then Jesus returns and he consummates the kingdom. And what I mean by that is, think resurrection, final judgment, new heavens, new earth. Okay? And just like amillennialism, postmillennial, most of them believe that 1,000 years is not literal. Okay? It's just symbolic for a long period of time. And so, much like amillennials, postmillennials do not believe that Christ is physically reigning on the earth during the millennium. Okay? Instead, Christians, because of the spread of the gospel, have such an influence on society that Christ's reign comes through the hearts of believers. Okay? The gospel's preached all throughout the world. People believe it. And society is transformed into a blessed state. Questions about that so far? Yes. There will be a test and an essay. And an essay. Sure. That's all right. Well, if you think about it, you just say, "Oh, I got it," and we'll stop. Yes. And then war breaks out. Okay, yes. Mm, sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Right, right. Yeah, sure. And cat out of the bag, I'm not a post millennial. Okay, and I'll share just like we did with all millennial. Like I'll show like these are the challenges that post millennial faces. But even as if you wonder, like I think I say it each week, but I wonder where does Brother Cody fall in these boxes of views? I'm historic premillennial. Okay, that's my view. But even in that, right? Like, yet we believe in the power of the gospel to save and transform and change people, right? Like that is absolutely one of the things that comes about. But when we take a step back and we look at the world as a whole, okay, we're going to talk about that in a moment. I think postmillennialism, in my view, is entirely too optimistic, okay? Too optimistic about where the world is going. And that we'll talk about that when we get to those challenges, okay? Sure. Yeah. Sure. He said it's on Fox. Sure. Yeah, that out. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Yes. Yes. And my point's going to be we got some biblical reasoning for that too, and we'll get there. Okay. So the idea is at some point during the church age before Jesus comes back, society is improved because of the advance of the gospel that it ushers in the millennium on earth. Okay? Even though Jesus is not present physically to reign on the earth, okay, the millennium still comes because of the advance of the gospel. And then Jesus comes. Okay? So as it relates to Revelation 20 specifically, okay, in postmillennialism, it sees Revelation 20 not as a future kingdom that begins when Jesus returns, which is what premillennialism believes, okay? But instead, Revelation 20 describes a long period in history where the gospel so transforms the world that it's as if Christ is reigning on the earth. And then he comes. Okay? And so, just like we did with amillennialism, okay, what are the scriptural supports for this view, right? And the primary support, all right, that postmillennials are going to point to is the parables of Jesus. Okay, a couple of those parables, and particularly the parables Jesus tells about how the kingdom grows. All right? How it starts off small, but over time it grows larger. All right? And so here we have Matthew 13, 31 through 32. And it is the parable of the mustard seed. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Okay? So that's why they say, yes, the gospel is going to so spread on the earth that the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of heaven, is the greatest, the biggest kingdom in the world, and it has the greatest influence, and so naturally society will be improved. Okay? Or just a couple verses later, okay, the parable of the leaven. All right, Matthew 13, 33. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. Okay? So you take a big thing of flour, you take just a little leaven, you put the leaven in it, and it mixes and it mixes and it mixes until how much of it gets leavened? All of it. And they say, see, this is how the kingdom comes in the earth. And it will be to such an extent that society improves and flourishes and righteousness reigns. And that is the millennium. Okay? Post-millennials will also emphasize the Great Commission. Remember what Jesus said? All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and do what? Make disciples of all the nations. Okay? So the gospel will be so successful, okay, that disciples are made of all nations on the earth. And then the millennium, because righteousness reigns. Okay? So what about Revelation 20 altogether? Okay, I want to walk through what a postmillennial, how they interpret the specific details in Revelation 20. And some of you asked about that, and we kind of answered it already. Okay, but in Revelation 20, a postmillennial, how do they interpret the binding of Satan? Okay, and they say the same thing we did. A non-millennial says, okay, that because of Christ's work and his resurrection and ascension, that Satan's power to deceive the nations has been restricted. Okay, he's still active in the world, but he cannot prevent the global spread of the gospel that will bring about the millennium. Okay, again, what do they believe about the 1,000 years in Revelation 20? That it's symbolic, not literal, that represents a long period of time. And during this period of time, these 1,000 years, it's an extended period of gospel success, that the gospel spreads widely, nations are discipled, and society is increasingly shaped by biblical truth and righteousness. Okay? Third, how does a postmillennial interpret the reign of the saints with Christ? Okay? And they interpret it in 2 senses. The first is, like all millennials, they believe that the reign of the saints with Christ is believers reigning with Jesus in heaven spiritually who have died. Okay? And then secondly, they believe the believers' reign with Christ is their increasing visible influence on the earth. Okay? As the gospel progresses in the world. Okay? Fourth, like all millennials, postmillennials believe in one physical resurrection. So they interpret that first resurrection in Revelation 20 to be spiritual resurrection in the intermediate state. And they believe there is one physical resurrection when Jesus comes bodily, visibly, gloriously, when believers and unbelievers are raised at the same time, and then there is one final judgment. Okay? One thing that needs to be discussed is, so we read about in Revelation 20, it's in verses 7 through 10, that that Satan is unbound, right? He's released. So how does that square with the idea that the world progressively gets better? And yet Satan gets released, and then there's this rebellion that takes place. Okay, how does that work? Well, they say near the end of the millennium, near the end of the golden age, Satan is released for a short time to lead that little rebellion. And really, we talk about how it's this great war, right? This battle of Armageddon. Y'all heard about that before? That's what this rebellion is. It's really not even a battle. Like, Jesus just shows up and all the enemies are defeated, like in an instant, okay? All right, well, that's what they say, okay? Near the end of the millennium, Satan is released, there's this rebellion that takes place, and then Jesus comes and crushes it, okay? And during that rebellion, there's this brief resurgence of evil, all right? Okay, questions about that? If any. Revelation 20 describes that an angel is the one that binds him, right? The angel binds him, throws him in a pit, and seals the pit, right? But that's about all the information we have on that as far as that goes. Okay. All right, let's talk about the strengths of this view. Or how about this? Let's just start with so far, do you think postmillennialism is a viable view? Like it's a view you could believe and hold to? Some maybe, some not. Okay, that's good. That's one of the challenges we're going to talk about. All right, that's one of the challenges we're going to talk about. All right, let's talk about the strengths then first. Here's the strengths of this view. And the first is postmillennialists, there's a strong confidence in the power of the gospel, right? Like it is the spreading, the sharing of the good news of the life, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus that brings this millennium in. Like they believe that the gospel is powerful, it saves, and it transforms. Like that is good, right? That is good. That is a strength. They really believe the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, like Paul says in Romans 1. Okay? And listen, even though I'm a premillennial, I believe this too. Okay? We should all believe this. And the power of the gospel, the strength of the gospel, our confidence in the gospel, that God uses it to save and change and transform people, families, communities. Like we believe that, right? Okay, good. All right. And so, because of their confidence in the power of the gospel, they're very optimistic about the influence sharing the gospel has on people, society, and the world. Okay? Second, postmillennialism wants to see Christ's kingdom advance and grow on earth. Okay? Like just like that leaven spreads among all the flour, right? All the dough. They believe in the advance of Christ's kingdom on the earth. And so they take very seriously how Jesus taught us to pray. Your will be done where? On earth as it is in heaven. Okay? Now, they do that because they believe that it's the gradual spread of the gospel that brings the millennium in. Okay? But still, we should seek to advance that kingdom as well. Okay? Third, postmillennialism promotes a good and righteous society. That's a good thing, right? Very much so, okay? Because, again, they believe the gospel changes people, it changes society, and it changes even government. Okay, so those are strengths. Those are strengths. Here's the challenges. And really, why I'm not a postmillennial. Okay? So, postmillennialism, in regards to how it interprets Revelation 20, okay, faces some of those challenges that we outlined with amillennialism. Okay? Specifically, like interpreting the first resurrection in Revelation 20 as the spiritual life we have in heaven after we die. Okay, if you remember, I told you that everywhere in the New Testament, the Greek word anastasis for resurrection is used. It's always in reference to a physical resurrection. It's never used to talk about a spiritual resurrection. And so, just like an amillennial, a postmillennial has to say, well, this is the one exception in the whole Bible where it's used for spiritual. And I told you last week that's weak. And I still think it's weak for postmillennialism as well. Okay? It faces the same challenge of amillennialism with the binding of Satan. Right? Like we said that when we read the scriptures, it seems like Satan has more power and influence than what amillennials and postmillennials want to believe. Okay? Like those verses about how he prowls around like a lion, or how Paul says that he is the God of this world. Okay? That doesn't sound very bound. Another challenge it faces, just like amillennialism, is the fact that, in my view, what I think is that Revelation 20 reads like a sequence of events that follows Revelation 19. So what happens in Revelation 19? We talked about it last week. Before we talk about Revelation 20 and the Millennium, a big event happens in chapter 19, verses 11 through 16. It's the return of Jesus. Okay? So after the return of Jesus, then we go to chapter 20, and John says 3 times, then I saw, then this happened, then. Okay? And so the natural reading is that Jesus comes, then the events of chapter 20 happen. Okay? All right, another challenge is that postmillennialism teaches that Revelation 20 is about gradual progress. But chapter 20 reads like it's immediate and decisive. Okay? So we read in chapter 20 that there is a decisive binding of Satan, that there is a defined reign, that there is a sudden release. And a postmillennial's belief is that, well, no, that period of time is describing gradual progress of the gospel. Okay? And then the last 2 challenges, I think, are the 2 biggest ones. The present reality of evil. Okay? Postmillennialism has to account for the present reality of evil. And what I mean by that is, by all accounts and measures, the world isn't getting better. Okay? Like the historical, like if postmillennialism is true, then the moral progression of the world should be more advanced over the last 2,000 years than it is. Does that make sense? And another issue I have is, right, those places where 1,500 years ago, the gospel was strong, there was strong gospel influence. A lot of those places now have no gospel influence. Like I'm thinking like the Middle East. You know, the Bible, these churches Paul wrote to, do you know where these churches were? They're in present-day Muslim-dominated countries today. Right? So like this progressive, gradual moral progress doesn't seem to be on a historical uptrend. Right? The world is not becoming more just and more righteous. There continues to be global conflict and war and persecution, and moral decline. So by and large, society, when we look back on history, okay, like from where we are today and we look back over human history, can we say that the world is on an upward trajectory of righteousness? I don't think so. Again, that's why Andrew pointed out, like postmillennialism was the dominant view for like 500 years. And what changed that was World War I and World War II. Because people were like, wow, it's a whole bunch of evil and unrighteousness and death. And they changed their views. Like most of the Puritans in the 1700s were postmillennials. Because in their mind, yes, there is moral progression. But now, on the other side of history, we can see, well, no, it has not progressed in that sense. So that's the third reason. Here's the fourth reason, the fourth challenge, and it's a big one. The New Testament teaches the world gets worse, not better before Jesus returns. Okay? I got one scripture for us to read, and then we got to go. But if you want to write down Matthew 24 and go read it. But it's 2 Timothy 3. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. People will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. Every day, right? The New Testament teaches the world gets worse before Jesus returns. And that is the exact opposite of the whole framework of postmillennialism, right? That the world progressively improves, becomes more righteousness, and then Jesus returns. Okay? All right, questions, and then we got to go. Or comments. Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. No other questions? So if I do a quiz on the differences between amillennialism and postmillennialism next week, we're all just going to ace it. Ace it. Okay, take your sheets home with you, study them, look at them. And the comparison chart, that second page on the back side of your page, has what each view believes about certain aspects. So millennium, return, tribulation, all that stuff. Okay? And then hopefully next time we'll look at both of those premillennial views, which I think is probably where almost all of us are in one of those two. Okay? No questions?